Father John Geoghan, Boston, Massachusetts. John Joseph Geoghan was born in 1935 into a working-class Irish Catholic family in the Boston area, a city where the church was not just a place of worship but a pillar of identity. In neighborhoods shaped by parish boundaries, priests were figures of unquestioned authority. They baptized newborns, presided over marriages, buried the dead, and were often treated with more trust than teachers, doctors, or police officers. To grow up Catholic in Boston in the mid-20th century was to grow up believing that priests were moral anchors, men chosen by God and placed above suspicion. Geoghan followed a path that, on the surface, appeared ordinary for someone of his background. He attended Catholic schools, entered the seminary, and was ordained as a priest in 1962. He was assigned to parishes across the Archdiocese of Boston, often working with youth programs, altar boys, and religious education classes. To parents, he appeared approachable and gentle. He volunteered to babysit. He invited boys on outings. He gained access not through force, but through familiarity. The setting in which Geoghan operated is crucial to understanding how his crimes unfolded. In the decades following his ordination, Catholic families were taught questioning a priest was often equated with questioning faith itself. Children were raised to obey clergy without hesitation. Confession, counseling, and spiritual guidance created private spaces where boundaries blurred and accountability vanished. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the first warnings emerged. Boys began telling their parents that Father Geoghan had touched them inappropriately. Some described abuse during swimming trips, overnight stays, or private meetings in rectories. Others spoke of incidents that occurred in their own homes while their parents were nearby, unaware that anything was wrong. When parents confronted church officials, they were met with reassurance. They were told their sons had misunderstood. They were told Geoghan was under stress, that he needed counseling, that the matter would be handled internally. What was never suggested was calling the police. Instead, a pattern formed. When complaints reached a certain level, Geoghan was quietly removed from a parish and reassigned elsewhere. No warnings were issued to new congregations. No records followed him that parishioners could access. Internally, however, the Archdiocese documented everything. Memos were written, reports were filed, psychiatric evaluations warned that Geoghan posed a danger to children and was likely to reoffend if placed in unsupervised contact with minors. Those warnings were ignored. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Geoghan continued abusing children across multiple parishes. Estimates later suggested more than 130 victims, though many believe the true number was far higher. Some victims were as young as 4 years old. Many carried their trauma into adulthood, struggling with addiction, depression, and fractured relationships. Several would later die by suicide. What made Geoghan's crimes particularly devastating was not only their scale, but their predictability. Each reassignment followed the same trajectory. A new parish, a fresh start, new children, new victims. The institution designed to protect the faithful became the mechanism that enabled abuse. By the early 1990s, cracks began to form in the wall of silence. Civil lawsuits were filed. Survivors began connecting with one another, realizing they were not alone. Still, progress was slow. Settlements were reached quietly. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Public acknowledgement remained minimal. Everything changed in 2002. That year, journalists from the Boston Globe's investigative Spotlight team published a series of articles exposing systemic sexual abuse within the Archdiocese of Boston and the deliberate cover-up by church leadership. At the center of those revelations was Father John Geoghan. Internal church documents were made public, showing that Cardinal Bernard Law and other officials had known about Geoghan's abuse for decades. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Parishioners felt betrayed. Survivors felt vindicated and re-traumatized all at once. Protesters gathered outside churches. Trust in the institution collapsed almost overnight. Under mounting pressure, prosecutors pursued criminal charges. In January 2002, Geoghan was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child molestation. For many victims, this was the first time they had seen their abuser held accountable by the justice system. The trial focused on one victim, a 10-year-old boy abused in the early 1990s. Survivors packed the courtroom. The defense argued diminished responsibility and pointed to Geoghan's advanced age. The prosecution laid out a clear narrative of predation enabled by institutional negligence. Geoghan was convicted and sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison. The sentence, while symbolically significant, felt painfully inadequate to many survivors who had lost entire lifetimes to trauma. In August 2003, less than a year into his sentence, Geoghan was murdered in his prison cell. He was beaten to death by another inmate, a convicted murderer who later stated he killed Geoghan because of his crimes against children. Reactions to his death were complex. Some saw it as vigilante justice. Others felt robbed of the opportunity to confront him further. For many survivors, his death brought no closure. The damage had already been done. The aftermath of the Geoghan case extended far beyond one man. Cardinal Law resigned and relocated to Rome. The Archdiocese of Boston paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements, eventually declaring bankruptcy. Worldwide, thousands of abuse cases surfaced as victims realized they were not isolated incidents, but part of a global pattern. Yet the most haunting aspect of the story lies not in the courtroom or the headlines, but in the years before any of it came to light. Years when warnings were written down and ignored. Years when children spoke and were dismissed. Years when the church chose reputation over protection. John Geoghan did not act in a vacuum. His crimes were facilitated by a system that valued silence over safety and obedience over accountability. The question that lingers is not simply how one priest was able to abuse so many children, but how many people had the power to stop him, chose not to. When faith becomes unquestionable authority, and authority goes unchecked, evil does not need to hide. It is invited in, trusted, and allowed to stay. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Pastor Jim Bakker, United States. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, Jim Bakker was seen as a symbol of modern Christian success. In the 1970s and early 1980s, he stood at the forefront of a new religious movement, televangelism. Through carefully produced broadcasts, emotional sermons, and polished smiles, Bakker convinced millions of viewers that faith, when properly practiced, would be rewarded with prosperity. God, he preached, wanted believers to be healthy, wealthy, and victorious. And Jim Bakker appeared to be living proof. Born in 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, Bakker grew up in a devout Christian household. He attended North Central Bible College and quickly discovered his talent for communication. Unlike traditional pastors, Bakker understood television. He knew how to frame a message, how to build suspense, how to turn belief into spectacle. Alongside his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, he co-founded the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord, or, as critics later joked, Pass the Loot. The PTL Club was not just a religious program, it was entertainment. Bright sets, upbeat music, celebrity guests, and tearful testimonies filled the screen. Tammy Faye's emotional openness and Jim Bakker's confident preaching created a sense of intimacy with viewers at home. People felt personally connected to them. Many believed they were watching spiritual leaders chosen and blessed by God. Donations poured in. Viewers sent money believing it was funding ministry, charity, and outreach. Instead, much of it fueled an empire. Bakker used PTL funds to build Heritage USA, a massive Christian-themed resort in South Carolina. Marketed as a wholesome family destination, Heritage USA included hotels, water parks, shopping centers, and future expansion plans that promised luxury wrapped in faith. To finance this dream, Bakker devised a scheme that would later define his downfall. Supporters were sold lifetime partnerships, which promised them annual stays at Heritage USA for life. Tens of thousands bought in, often sending savings they could barely afford to give. What they didn't know was that the number of partnerships sold far exceeded the resort's capacity. Most would never receive what they were promised. Behind the scenes, the image of righteous living collapsed further. Jim Bakker lived lavishly, using donated money for private jets, luxury cars, expensive vacations, and multiple homes. PTL staff described an atmosphere of excess, secrecy, and pressure. Financial records were hidden or manipulated. Questions were discouraged. The first crack in the facade came not from finances, but from sex. In 1987, a former church secretary named Jessica Hahn came forward, alleging that Jim Bakker had sexually assaulted her in a hotel room in Florida years earlier. According to Hahn, Bakker used his authority and influence to coerce her, then paid her hush money through church funds. The story ignited media frenzy. Bakker initially denied wrongdoing, framing himself as a victim of temptation and spiritual attack. He tearfully resigned from PTL, claiming forgiveness and repentance. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something far larger than an affair. They found fraud on a massive scale. Federal investigators examined PTL's finances and discovered that Bakker had misled donors repeatedly. Money earmarked for specific projects was diverted. Lifetime partnerships were knowingly oversold. Accounting records were deliberately obscured. This was not mismanagement, it was deception. In 1989, Jim Bakker was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The trial painted a devastating portrait. Prosecutors argued that Bakker preyed on vulnerable believers, many elderly or low-income, exploiting their faith for personal gain. Former supporters testified about sending money they desperately needed, believing God would bless their sacrifice. Bakker's defense leaned heavily on religious rhetoric. He claimed he trusted others with finances. He portrayed himself as naive rather than malicious. But the evidence told a different story. Internal memos, financial documents, and witness testimony showed that Bakker was deeply involved in the schemes. When the verdict came down, it was swift and decisive. Jim Bakker was convicted on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and fined $500,000. The sentence shocked the nation, symbolizing not just punishment for one man, but condemnation of an entire culture of unaccountable religious power. The aftermath was catastrophic. PTL collapsed. Heritage USA fell into bankruptcy and was sold off piece by piece. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. Supporters felt humiliated and spiritually betrayed. For many, faith itself became tainted by association. Tammy Faye Bakker divorced Jim during his imprisonment, later reinventing herself as a figure of resilience and compassion, particularly toward marginalized communities. Jim Bakker, meanwhile, became a symbol of hypocrisy. In 1991, his sentence was reduced after an appeals court ruled it excessive. He served nearly 5 years before being released. Upon release, Bakker claimed spiritual renewal. Incredibly, he returned to ministry, later launching new religious broadcasts and survivalist-themed programs. Critics argued this demonstrated how easily disgraced religious figures could re-enter positions of influence. The long-term damage, however, could not be undone. Many former supporters never returned to church. Some lost homes, savings, and trust. Others struggled with guilt, believing they had been foolish to believe so deeply. The Jim Bakker scandal forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths. Faith, when intertwined with money and celebrity, becomes vulnerable to exploitation. Religious language can be used not only to inspire, but to manipulate. And when leaders are placed beyond scrutiny, accountability disappears. The most chilling aspect of the Bakker case is not that fraud occurred, but how long it thrived in plain sight. Viewers watched every day. They donated willingly. They believed completely, and in that belief, the crime flourished. When spiritual authority is monetized, deception does not feel like theft, it feels like destiny. And by the time the illusion shatters, the damage is already done. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Father Patrick Nix, New Orleans, Louisiana. In New Orleans, Catholicism is woven into the fabric of daily life. Churches stand on nearly every major street, their bells marking time in neighborhoods shaped by tradition and ritual. For generations, priests were not merely spiritual leaders but moral authorities, men whose words carried weight far beyond the pulpit. In this environment, Father Patrick Nix built his career quietly, moving through parishes with little fanfare, leaving behind a trail that would not surface publicly until decades later. Patrick Joseph Nix was ordained as a Catholic priest in the mid-20th century and assigned to serve within the Archdiocese of New Orleans. 2 parishioners, he appeared unremarkable in the way that often breeds trust. He was not a celebrity priest. He did not command attention through charisma or controversy. Instead, he blended in a familiar face at Mass, a steady presence in parish schools, a man who seemed devoted to routine and service. It was within that ordinary setting that the earliest signs of abuse emerged. Nix worked closely with children. He had access to altar servers, youth groups, and parish schools. Parents trusted him implicitly, allowing unsupervised contact without hesitation. In a culture where priests were viewed as safe by definition, safeguards were unnecessary at least. That was the belief. Behind closed doors, Nix abused that trust. Survivors would later describe sexual abuse that occurred in rectories, classrooms, and other church-controlled spaces. The abuse was not a single lapse or isolated incident. It was repeated, deliberate, and sustained over years. As early as the 1960s and 1970s, complaints surfaced. Children told parents. Parents brought concerns to church officials. Internally, the archdiocese became aware that something was wrong. But as with so many cases during that era, the response was not accountability, was containment. Rather than report Nix to law enforcement, church leadership chose reassignment. He was moved from parish to parish, sometimes with vague explanations about pastoral needs or temporary leave. Parishioners in new communities were never informed of past allegations. Each transfer gave Nix a clean slate and fresh access to children. This pattern continued for decades. What made the situation particularly disturbing was the documentation. Church records later revealed that officials were not ignorant. They discussed allegations internally. They noted concerns. In some cases, Nix was sent for counseling or evaluation. Yet time and again, he was returned to ministry. For the victims, silence was enforced not only by fear but by faith. Many survivors described feeling guilt and confusion. They believed they had sinned. They feared punishment from God. Some were told explicitly not to speak, warned that accusations against a priest would harm the church or destroy their families. As years passed, many victims carried their trauma into adulthood. Some struggled with substance abuse. Others distanced themselves from religion entirely. A few attempted to come forward again, only to be met with institutional resistance. It wasn't until the broader Catholic abuse crisis began unfolding nationally that the case of Patrick Nix resurfaced publicly. In the early 2000s, following revelations in Boston and elsewhere, survivors in New Orleans began filing civil lawsuits. Names that had once been buried in diocesan files were suddenly exposed. Patrick Nix was named in multiple lawsuits accusing him of sexual abuse of minors. The Archdiocese of New Orleans acknowledged the allegations and eventually removed him from active ministry. He was laicist formally stripped of his priesthood, but only after decades of alleged abuse. By that time, criminal prosecution was no longer possible. Statutes of limitation had expired. Evidence had faded. Witnesses had aged. Nix lived out his remaining years without facing criminal court for his alleged crimes. The investigations that followed did not stop with Nix himself. They turned toward the institution that had protected him. Survivors and advocates questioned how many children could have been spared if early warnings had been taken seriously. Internal documents showed a pattern of prioritizing reputation over safety, secrecy over justice. The Archdiocese eventually paid settlements to survivors, though the amounts varied and were often accompanied by confidentiality agreements. For many victims, the money felt secondary. What they wanted was acknowledgement and admission that what happened was real, that it mattered, that it was wrong. Patrick Nix died without ever being convicted of a crime. His name faded from headlines, but not from memory. For survivors, the absence of a courtroom reckoning left a permanent void. The aftermath in New Orleans mirrored that of other dioceses across the country. Trust eroded, attendance declined, parishioners questioned what else had been hidden. Families re-examined memories, wondering whether warning signs had been missed or ignored. The most chilling aspect of the Nix case lies in its quietness. There were no dramatic arrests, no televised trials, no dramatic confession. Instead, there was a slow, deliberate process of concealment that allowed harm to continue unchecked. Patrick Nix did not rely on violence or force. He relied on the assumption that a priest could not be dangerous. He relied on an institution that treated allegations as inconveniences rather than emergencies. And he relied on silence earned through fear, reverence, and misplaced loyalty. When the church finally acknowledged the truth, it was not a revelation, it was a confirmation of what victims had known all along, that their pain had been seen, documented, and ignored. The haunting question left behind is not whether Patrick Nix was guilty in the eyes of the law. It is how many opportunities there were to stop him and how many times those opportunities were deliberately passed over. In the shadow of the pulpit, where faith should have offered protection, harm was allowed to take root, and by the time the truth emerged, the damage had already spread across generations. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934 in Joplin, Missouri, a small town that never predicted the rise of a man who would one day command a religious empire, control thousands of followers, and eventually fall in one of the darkest pastor scandals in American history. His early life was shaped by poverty, instability, and an almost singular obsession with fame. From a young age, he sought the spotlight, pursuing a career in Hollywood as a singer and promoter. But when fame never materialized, he pivoted towards something more powerful: religion. By the mid-1960s, the counterculture movement in California provided fertile ground for charismatic preachers promising salvation. With sweeping rhetoric, fiery sermons, and a penetrating stare that many described as hypnotic, Tony Alamo began recruiting lost youth, runaways, addicts, and people desperate for meaning. His message centered on repentance, divine judgment, and an apocalyptic vision of the future. These ingredients gave birth to what would become the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation, named after Tony and his wife, Susan Alamo. Their ministry began in Hollywood, where they ran communal homes filled with tightly controlled followers. Tony's sermons blended in time's prophecy, strict moral rules, authoritarian control, and promises of divine protection. As the ministry grew, so did Tony's sense of power. He enforced a rigid lifestyle on his followers. No dating, no music, no fashion choices without permission, no independent thought. He demanded complete obedience, claiming that he alone knew God's truth and that the world outside was poisoned by sin. Susan Alamo, Tony's wife, brought a different side to the ministry. She had an empathetic charisma that made her a comforting presence to new recruits. Together, they became a force-stone as the fire, Susan as the warmth. Their message was simple: follow us, and God will save you. Resist us, and God will punish you. The couple expanded their operations into rural Arkansas, building large compounds where followers lived, worked, and worshipped. Tony implemented labor systems that critics later described as forced labor. Followers worked in businesses owned by the Alamos for no wages, believing their efforts were offerings to God. These operations included construction companies, clothing manufacturing, print shops, and dozens of service industries supporting the Alamos' growing wealth. But while the Alamos presented themselves as humble prophets, their lifestyle told a different story. They lived in luxury custom suits, expensive jewelry, extravagant homes, while their followers lived in austere dormitories, often surviving on minimal food and working long hours under harsh conditions. Tony taught that material wealth was a blessing from God, but only for those chosen by him conveniently. That included himself. The first major shift came in 1982, when Susan Alamo died of cancer. Her death cracked the facade of the ministry's stability. Followers were told she wasn't truly dead, only temporarily unavailable, and that she would rise again. For months, her body was kept in the compound, preserved through freezing and chemical treatment, as Tony insisted resurrection was imminent. Followers stood guard by the coffin, praying for the miracle Tony promised. When Susan did not rise, Tony's behavior grew even more extreme. He declared himself the sole prophet of the ministry and began implementing increasingly bizarre and authoritarian rules. His sermons became darker, filled with threats of damnation, divine wrath, and predictions of imminent apocalypse. Former followers later recounted that Tony used fear as his primary weapon: fear of hell, fear of punishment, fear of spiritual abandonment. Reports began to surface of severe beatings in the compound. Children were disciplined with wooden boards. Adults were humiliated, isolated, or denied food for perceived disobedience. Critics said Tony fostered a climate of terror where followers were afraid to speak, behave, or even think outside his will. He told them that leaving the ministry meant eternal damnation. As authorities began investigating labor violations, tax fraud, and child mistreatment, Tony became increasingly paranoid. He moved followers across state lines, hid children from state agencies, and fortified his properties. Despite mounting scrutiny, he retained devoted supporters, many of whom believed he was being persecuted for preaching God's truth. The true horror of Tony Alamo's legacy emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Former members came forward detailing child abuse, forced marriages, and sexual exploitation, all orchestrated by Tony under the guise of religious doctrine. Testimony revealed that Tony used scripture to justify taking multiple underage girls as wives, claiming it was part of God's plan. He forced families to surrender daughters, warning them that resistance meant divine punishment. The girls were groomed, psychologically manipulated, and isolated. Tony told them they were chosen by God, and that their obedience was a holy duty. Survivors described years of trauma rapes framed as spiritual unions, physical punishments for disobedience, and threats that their families would be cast out or damned if they resisted. Federal investigators built a case, interviewing dozens of victims. They tracked financial fraud, forced labor networks, and transportation of minors across state lines for sexual purposes. The evidence was overwhelming, not only of the abuse itself, but of the intentional structure Tony created to hide his actions. Followers were taught never to speak to outsiders, never to question Tony, and always to obey in silence. In 2008, Tony Alamo was arrested and charged with sexual exploitation of minors, transportation of minors for illicit purposes, and federal child abuse violations. The trial included harrowing testimony from victims who had suffered under his control for years. They described manipulation, threats of hell, severe beatings, and being forced into sexual relationships with the pastor who claimed divine authority. Tony's defense attempted to argue that the relationships were consensual, that the accusations were part of a government conspiracy, and that the girls' families supported the marriages. But evidence showed these so-called marriages were built on coercion, manipulation, and intimidation. Many of the victims were underage, some as young as 8 or 12 when the abuse began. In 2009, Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge delivered a scathing statement, condemning the pastor for exploiting faith, abusing power, and destroying lives. Survivors wept as the verdict was read, many experiencing justice for the first time after years of silence. Following the conviction, the federal government seized church properties, dissolved parts of the Alamo Empire, and assisted survivors with relocation and recovery services. Former followers described the emotional devastation of realizing that the man they believed was a prophet had been a predator. Many struggled to rebuild their lives after decades inside a closed religious system that discouraged education, independence, or outside contact. Tony Alamo remained unrepentant until his death in 2017, claiming persecution and insisting he was chosen by God. But his death did little to erase the trauma he inflicted. His victims, now adults, continued fighting for recognition, reparations, and healing. Advocacy groups highlighted his case as one of the most extreme examples of pastoral abuse in American history, a reminder of how easily religious authority can be twisted into a tool of domination. The story of Tony Alamo reveals the dangerous intersection of charisma, unchecked power, and religious isolation. His ability to manipulate scripture allowed him to build a system where exploitation was justified as divine will, obedience was demanded as holy duty, and suffering was framed as spiritual purification. People joined, seeking hope, and found instead a prison of control, fear, and violence. Communities and experts have since studied the Alamo ministry to understand how such an environment forms. The consensus, when a leader claims exclusive access to God's will, discourages outside influence, and demands absolute authority, vulnerability transforms into captivity. The tragedy of Tony Alamo is not only what he did, but how he convinced so many that his actions were righteous. Even today, survivors speak at conferences, warning others to recognize the signs of spiritual manipulation. They discuss the long-term effects, PTSD, anxiety, fear of religious institutions, and struggles with trust. Their strength, resilience, and willingness to expose their suffering have become a testament to courage and a reminder that silence enables abuse. Tony Alamo built his empire with scripture in one hand and control in the other, but the truth eventually shattered the illusion. His story endures as a lesson that faith, when weaponized, becomes a tool of bondage, and that no sermon, no prophecy, and no claim of divine authority excuses the exploitation of the innocent. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Father Joseph Maskell, Baltimore, Maryland. Joseph Maskell was not a stranger in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. To outsiders, he appeared as a devoted Catholic priest and counselor, dedicated to guiding young people through their formative years. He worked as a chaplain at Archbishop Keogh High School for girls and held positions in Catholic social services, counseling, and community programs. On paper, Maskell was a pillar of spiritual guidance, a man entrusted with shaping the moral and emotional lives of countless young women. But behind the facade of the devoted priest lay a pattern of exploitation and abuse that would haunt his victims for decades. Maskell is widely suspected of committing sexual abuse against scores of students during the 1960s and 1970s, using his authority and spiritual influence to manipulate, intimidate, and silence those in his care. Maskell was particularly insidious because he leveraged psychological manipulation alongside sexual misconduct. Students recalled therapy sessions where he claimed they were sinful, damaged, or unworthy of love unless they obeyed him completely. He blurred the lines between guidance and control, using religious language to coerce obedience. By telling girls that questioning him or revealing their experiences was a sin, he effectively weaponized faith itself to keep victims silent. The setting of Keogh High School, a parochial girls' school, allowed Maskell ready access to minors. The institution relied heavily on trust and the presumed moral integrity of its staff. Teachers, administrators, and parents believed that Maskell was acting in the students' best interests. Few dared to question a priest. When complaints or rumors surfaced, they were often dismissed, minimized, or handled internally without reporting to law enforcement. Maskell's manipulations went beyond sexual abuse. Reports surfaced of him exposing students to extreme psychological control. He used fear, shame, and intimidation to maintain dominance. Some students described sessions where he would track their behavior, create narratives about evil influences, and subtly pit them against one another, cultivating paranoia and isolation. The crimes remained largely hidden during Maskell's lifetime. He died in 2001 without facing criminal prosecution, leaving a trail of unresolved allegations. The lack of accountability became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Victims' attempts to report him while he was alive were often ignored or delayed, a reflection of institutional failures at multiple levels. Decades later, Maskell's name resurfaced in connection with the unsolved murder of Sister Kathy Sesnick, a nun at Keogh High School. Sister Sesnick had supported victims and reportedly helped them speak out about sexual abuse within the school. She disappeared in 1969, and her body was discovered months later. Some investigators and researchers theorized that Maskell may have been linked to her death. Though no definitive proof has ever been confirmed, the case remains officially unsolved, shrouded in suspicion and speculation. Civil litigation in the 1990s and 2000s brought Maskell's alleged abuses to light. Survivors shared testimony of repeated sexual assaults, manipulative counseling sessions, and intimidation tactics designed to suppress disclosure. The Archdiocese of Baltimore faced lawsuits and eventually agreed to settlements totaling millions of dollars, though no criminal justice was served. The Maskell case highlighted the systemic failures that allowed such abuses to continue unchecked. It was not merely one man's wrongdoing, it was a failure of supervision, a culture of secrecy, and an environment that prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. Internal church documents later revealed that officials were aware of multiple allegations but failed to remove Maskell from positions of authority. For the survivors, the impact was lifelong. Many struggled with psychological trauma, depression, substance abuse, and fractured relationships. The betrayal by someone entrusted to guide and protect them created scars that no settlement could heal. For parents, the revelation that the man they trusted with their daughters had exploited them in the most intimate ways was devastating. Maskell's story forces a chilling reflection. How many others like him operated under the cover of faith, shielded by a culture that demanded obedience and silence? The combination of psychological manipulation, sexual abuse, and institutional complicity created an environment where victims had little chance of being heard. Even decades after his death, the questions linger. How many lives were irreparably harmed? How many crimes were never reported because of fear, shame, or misplaced faith? And perhaps most hauntingly, how could a man so trusted wield authority with such destruction, leaving behind only silence and suspicion? The legacy of Joseph Maskell is a stark reminder that authority, when unchallenged and cloaked in moral righteousness, can become a tool for exploitation. Trust, once betrayed in such profound ways, leaves wounds that echo through generations, and the echoes of that betrayal are not easily silenced. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Pastor Earl Paulk, Georgia Earl Paulk was, by all outward appearances, the embodiment of American megachurch success. Born in 1927 in Georgia, he rose from humble beginnings to become the founder of Chapel Hill Harvester Church, once one of the largest and most influential churches in the Southeast. Paulk preached with authority, delivering sermons that drew thousands of worshippers each week. He framed himself as a spiritual father, a man chosen by God to guide congregants through life's challenges and ensure their prosperity, faith, and obedience. His ministry was vast. The church included multiple campuses, a television broadcast reaching hundreds of thousands, and charitable programs designed to create the impression of outreach and benevolence. Paulk was widely celebrated. Local media profiled him as a dynamic religious leader, and church members revered him as an inspirational figure whose faith was unwavering and whose authority was absolute. Beneath the public persona, however, Paulk's private life was marked by abuse and manipulation. Over decades, allegations emerged that he engaged in sexual misconduct involving both minors and adults within his congregation. Survivors later described a pattern of coercion disguised as spiritual guidance. Women were groomed over time, often under the pretense of counseling sessions or special spiritual mentorship. In some cases, sexual acts were framed as divine instruction, making resistance feel not just impossible but sinful. The setting of a megachurch allowed these abuses to persist. Paulk's charisma, combined with the size of his following, created an environment where few dared to question his behavior. Staff and congregants were deeply loyal, often viewing criticism of Paulk as criticism of God himself. Many victims were isolated by social pressure, fearing ostracism from their faith communities if they spoke out. For years, complaints were either ignored or handled quietly. Internal staff members and church elders reportedly became aware of improprieties but often rationalized them or encouraged discretion, citing concerns about reputation, scandal, and the potential disruption of the ministry's work. This pattern of concealment mirrored the institutional failings seen in other religious abuse cases. The protection of the abuser was prioritized over the safety and dignity of victims. Civil lawsuits eventually brought Paulk's actions into the public eye. Victims came forward, recounting incidents that spanned decades, detailing emotional manipulation, sexual exploitation, and the long-term psychological consequences of abuse. The lawsuits forced the church and the broader public to confront uncomfortable truths about one of Georgia's most influential spiritual leaders. Though criminal charges were limited and some details remained unpublicized, he admitted to multiple acts of sexual misconduct, framing them in terms of personal failure and repentance. However, acknowledgement did not erase the trauma inflicted on those he manipulated or the damage done to the credibility of his church. The aftermath of Paulk's abuses extended far beyond legal ramifications. Congregants experienced disillusionment and betrayal. Families struggled to reconcile the man they revered with the actions now revealed. Survivors faced the daunting challenge of reclaiming autonomy over their own lives and healing from years of abuse that had been cloaked in spiritual authority. Earl Paulk died in 2009, leaving behind a legacy marked by both devotion and devastation. His ministry continued in diminished form under successors, but the shadow of his misconduct loomed large, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and unquestioned reverence. The case of Earl Paulk underscores a chilling reality. Spiritual leadership, when coupled with charisma and institutional protection, can facilitate abuse on a grand scale. When faith is weaponized to enforce obedience, and community loyalty is leveraged to silence victims, the consequences are devastating, extending across lives and generations. In reflecting on Paulk's life and crimes, one is forced to confront a sobering question: when the most trusted figures in a community exploit that trust for personal gratification, what safeguards are sufficient to protect the vulnerable? How many more could have suffered if accountability is delayed, ignored, or denied? The story of Earl Paulk is not only a record of personal moral failure, but a testament to the danger inherent in placing absolute faith in human authority without checks, transparency, or consequence. It reminds us that behind the grandeur of mega churches and the glow of charismatic sermons, darkness can quietly persist, leaving lasting damage on those who believed most deeply. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Lawrence Murphy was a priest in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whose name would become synonymous with one of the most egregious cases of clerical sexual abuse in American history. Born in 1917, Murphy was ordained in 1943 and assigned to serve at St. John's School for the Deaf in Milwaukee, a specialized institution that catered to children with hearing impairments. To outsiders, Murphy was a dedicated spiritual leader and educator, a man working to guide vulnerable children through both religious instruction and academic development. However, the environment of St. John's School for the Deaf, combined with a cultural reverence for clergy, created conditions in which Murphy could exploit his position for decades. Deaf children were uniquely vulnerable. Communication barriers meant they were often isolated from the wider world, unable to fully convey their experiences or be easily believed. Parents, trusting the institution, relied on the staff to protect their children. Murphy had authority, privacy, and institutional cover, a combination that would enable his decades-long abuse. The abuse began almost as soon as Murphy assumed his role at St. John's. He targeted boys in his care, manipulating their trust and exploiting their innocence. Victims later described systematic sexual assault that occurred in classrooms, dormitories, and private offices. Murphy often used fear and manipulation to maintain secrecy. He told boys that speaking about the incidents was a sin, or that they would be punished by God if they revealed his actions. Some survivors recalled being threatened with expulsion, social isolation, or ridicule if they attempted to disclose the abuse. Murphy's crimes were methodical and persistent. Over the course of the 1950s through the 1970s, he is estimated to have abused more than 200 children, though the true number may never be known. Each act was facilitated by the trust and authority the church conferred upon him. Staff and administrators knew little about the private interactions Murphy had with students, and when complaints were eventually raised, they were either dismissed or handled internally. Institutional complicity was a recurring theme. Church leadership, including bishops and other high-ranking officials, received reports of Murphy's inappropriate behavior. In some cases, complaints were documented in diocesan files. However, rather than removing him from his post or reporting him to law enforcement, officials chose to ignore or downplay the allegations. Murphy continued his work, allowed to remain in contact with children for decades. The victims of Murphy often internalized blame, believing that they had done something wrong or were inherently sinful. The church's emphasis on obedience and spiritual hierarchy reinforced this belief. Many survivors only realized in adulthood that what had happened was not their fault. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate abuse, shaping relationships, personal confidence, and trust and authority for the rest of their lives. As national awareness of clerical abuse grew in the 1990s and 2000s, the full scope of Murphy's crimes began to emerge. Investigators and journalists documented the staggering number of victims and the pattern of institutional cover-up. Civil lawsuits were filed against the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, leading to multi-million-dollar settlements for survivors. While financial compensation acknowledged the suffering of victims, it could not erase decades of trauma or restore the lost innocence of childhood. Murphy himself never faced criminal prosecution. By the time serious investigations began, the statute of limitations in Wisconsin prevented charges from being filed. He died in 1998, still shielded from criminal accountability, having avoided prison or public trial. This lack of legal resolution was a source of profound frustration and pain for survivors, many of whom had spent years gathering the courage to confront their past and seek justice. The impact on the broader community was severe. Parents who had once trusted the Archdiocese and the school were left questioning every aspect of the institution. Alumni of St. John's School for the Deaf wrestled with the duality of their experiences, the education and community they valued, overshadowed by the abuse perpetrated by someone in a position of absolute authority. Church attendance in some parishes declined, and the Archdiocese faced public outrage and scrutiny. Murphy's case became a catalyst for systemic change, highlighting the urgent need for reform in how institutions handle allegations of abuse. Policies on mandatory reporting, supervision, and transparency were revisited. survivor advocacy groups gained prominence, ensuring that the voices of those affected were heard and that future generations would be better protected. Despite these reforms, the lingering effects of Murphy's crimes continue to resonate. Many survivors report lifelong struggles with trust, intimacy, and mental health. Some carry guilt or shame, ingrained during childhood, that has required decades of therapy and support to confront. Others have become outspoken advocates, using their experiences to educate, prevent abuse, and push for accountability in religious institutions worldwide. The Murphy case also serves as a grim reminder of how vulnerability in institutional authority can intersect to create long-term harm. Deaf children, dependent on adults for communication, education, and care, were uniquely susceptible. Murphy exploited this vulnerability with impunity, shielded by both his clerical status and the broader culture of silence that pervaded the church at the time. Ultimately, the story of Lawrence Murphy is not just the story of one man's horrific acts. It is a case study in how power, trust, and institutional protection can be abused to devastating effect. It underscores the human cost when institutions prioritize reputation over the safety and dignity of children. When reflecting on the Murphy case, the most haunting question is how many other vulnerable children were exposed to danger simply because adults believed faith, hierarchy, or secrecy would safeguard them. The legacy is clear. Trust, once broken in such a profound way, leaves scars that span lifetimes, and the echoes of abuse can persist long after the perpetrator is gone. The victims of Lawrence Murphy continue to bear the weight of this legacy, and their courage in speaking out has forced a reckoning that challenges institutions to confront the darkness that can hide behind authority, faith, and the sanctity of the pulpit. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.